Preston's Attic. A short horror story. Written by Michael van der Voort. Narrated by Robin Reads. "It has always struck me as curious," Preston began, adopting, even in this personal letter to his sister, the dusty, overly formalized style common to those for whom scholarly pursuits have become a way of life. He was a Cambridge man, and, having no other living relatives and few friends outside of those whom he could also count as colleagues, he spent much of the ink from his pen not expended upon notes and essays, but corresponding with his ever-loving and miraculously ever-patient sibling. A sibling who, for her part, had become somewhat accustomed to her brother's habit of sharing his thoughts and musings in these interminable scrawlings. She, to her credit, maintained the habit of reading and responding to them in a timely fashion, albeit whilst also maintaining the necessary habit of skim-reading some of the more self-indulgent philosophical musings of the type that this particular missive threatened to become. Indeed, upon reading the words, "It has always struck me as curious," with which Preston had started this latest letter, she had literally sunk, resignedly, into a nearby chair with something that far better resembled a sigh than a smile upon her lips. "It has always struck me as curious," she read aloud to me, only slightly shaking her head as she did, "the way in which, even as adults, we can sometimes feel a sense of creeping trepidation or unease when required to enter a cellar or an attic." At this, Preston's sister, whom we might as well refer to as Sarah, since that is her given name, became a little more interested. In contrast to her brother, who had always been of the steadfastly sceptical type, she was a committed fan of those entertainments some would term supernatural, and found a particular fascination in any story that might claim to raise the hackles or chill the blood. Indeed, she had, since her teenage years, spent many a night enthralled by the works of Mr. Le Fanu and M.R. James, and, whilst her brother hardly seemed capable of producing anything that might rival the work of those gifted gentlemen, the first sentence at least promised something less mundane than his usual ponderings. "How odd it is to consider," Preston went on, "that even within the supposed safety of our own homes we should have certain shadowy areas that are capable of instilling within us a sense of apprehension, foreboding, and even fear. These are spaces, rooms after all, which in their brick-and-mortar composition are ostensibly identical to all others in the house, the only difference being that they are less frequently visited. Yet there is undeniably something difficult to articulate about those places, the shadowy borders that rest just upon the outskirts of our daily lives, that quietly but undoubtedly vexes the mind. I have seen men, grown men, rational and well-respected within their fields, visibly cringe at the short, clicking consonants of the word attic, or describe a simple errand, such as the retrieval of some object or other from the cellar or basement, as if it were an odious task fraught with danger. Can we be expected to believe that these gentlemen of good standing still retain their childhood fears of the dark? How best are we to account for these strange fancies? Is it perhaps that man naturally retains, even within his own dwelling, some reverence for the heavens above him and fear of the pit below? Does he perhaps see even within the structure of his own home a microcosm of his place within the universe? Or is it perhaps that these less trod spaces have replaced the fringes of the villages and camps from which we all came? That, in their shadowed spaces, they remind us all, in some small way, of those black fringes at the edge of the tree-line where the light of the fire will never quite reach, those points between the trees that remain unseen, but where we know, instinctively, that things with watching eyes and lolling tongues huddle, prowl, and wait. The letter I have quoted from and which was read aloud to me represents the first in a series of notes sent by my brother-in-law to his sister, my wife, around 3 months ago. I confess that whilst I did take note of my wife's reactions to these letters and listen as she read portions aloud, I paid little heed or attention to the letter's actual content. That is, until very recently, when my wife, who had always been in the diligent habit of collecting and preserving any and all correspondence between herself and her loved ones, even going to the trouble of collecting and binding them up into small bundles, storing them away for the supposed purpose of later examination and reflection, presented me with these particular missives and asked that I question Preston further on the matter. Precisely why she was compelled to dig up these forgotten letters, and indeed why she took the further step of insisting, quite forcefully, that I both revisit them and quiz Preston about them, was something of a mystery, though I will admit that I am glad she did so. For what was revealed through those letters and my subsequent conversations with Preston was a detailed first-hand account of a most singular occurrence, one which, with his permission, I intend to outline here. It would be best, perhaps, to begin with an explanation of exactly what it was that led Preston to his prolonged contemplation of attics and cellars in the first place. Preston's musings, and in turn his conviction that he should collect those musings on the page and subject his sister to them by way of the evening post, were initiated by a chance encounter he happened to have with a small boy. This boy, whom Preston identifies in his letter as the son of his host, had trundled enthusiastically along the corridor earlier that afternoon and passed several times by the open door of Preston's room in pursuit of some tin soldiers who had clearly broken ranks and gone missing in enemy territory beneath the rug. Preston, who had been busy making himself comfortable in his room, a space which he intended to occupy for a number of weeks, by making a fastidious and perhaps overly attentive fuss of arranging his books, noticed the boy and beckoned to him. Though, as a lifelong bachelor, Preston had never fathered any children of his own, he was not, as some within his college seemed to be, opposed to their existence on general principle. On the contrary, he was one of the few within his circle who remembered what it was like to have ever actually been a child. Calling to the boy with the intention of introducing himself, something he considered to be only polite, seeing as how he was planning to stay at the inn and would undoubtedly encounter the tiny chap daily, Preston bent down a little onto one knee to speak to him, adopting the manner and posture he had observed others use when speaking to children, and which seemed to have worked for them. "I say, did you manage to find the missing soldier in the end?" he asked with exaggerated curiosity, though he knew already that the boy had indeed retrieved the object of his fascination from its hiding-place under the rug. The boy, clearly not in the least bit shy around strangers, bounded forward, and in one pudgy hand proudly held out the tiny figurine, hoping to show his new friend not only that he had retrieved it, but that it was an object worthy of some comment. Preston admired the miniature hero with feigned enthusiasm, complimenting its detail and mentioning how brave the boy must be to command an entire regiment of such figures. The boy smiled, beaming with pride, and informed Preston that, indeed, he had over 30 similar figures, and that he put them through their paces daily. He was in the process of discussing some imagined battle that these brave tin warriors had recently fought, when he suddenly stopped midway through his sentence, and, letting out a small shriek, shrank backward, taking almost a full step away from the threshold of the room, and recoiling into the corridor with such speed that it was, Preston said, as if he had accidentally pressed his hand against the surface of a hot kettle. Troubled by this curious change in the boy, and hoping that he had not somehow upset the child in any way that might put a dark mark against his name with the boy's parents, Preston proceeded to question him as to what the matter was. At first, the boy remained silent. Speaking to me later, Preston recalled the two things that he noticed most keenly, and which left quite the impression upon him. Firstly, there was the way in which the boy, who had only seconds earlier been proudly displaying his soldier at arm's length, now clutched the tin brigadier tightly to his chest with both hands, the knuckles of the fingers straining white with the force of his grip, though whether this gesture was intended to protect the soldier itself or have it protect him was unclear. The second, and more immediately apparent change, was in the boy's demeanour, and especially his movement. Whereas only seconds earlier he had been all smiles and enthusiasm, now he seemed rigid and still, his eyes fixed squarely onto a space somewhere over Preston's right shoulder. Upon first turning to look back himself, Preston saw nothing that might account for such a marked change, and fully expected when he turned back to find the boy giggling or making some joke about having made him look. Instead, he found him once again, standing stock still with his mouth slightly agape. Still, the boy stared. "There is something incredibly unnerving," Preston told me later, "about the sight of real stillness in a child. Something equally unnerving as it is awful. It is the same manner of thing that you often see in war. Alongside casualties and the other more expected horrors, you see children, stunned by what they have seen, frozen in place, robbed of their animation, as if what they've seen, like the face of some dreadful Gorgon, had turned them all to stone. You see them standing there, silent and glassy-eyed, like the stuffed specimens of animals one finds in a museum. Seeing that boy doing nothing more offensive than standing perfectly still, with not a quiver of movement, was unnatural in a way far more horrifying than if he had screamed bloody murder and shouted for his mother." Following the boy's line of sight, in an attempt to see what he was staring at, Preston said he eventually gazed up at the ceiling of his room and, for the first time, noticed the small, dark rectangle that squatted, malevolently, in the corner. The dark square interrupted the otherwise uniform sea of beige like a black hole in the surface of a tooth. This hole, or hatch, Preston reasoned, must be the entrance to an attic space immediately above his room, a space for which the covering panel had either been removed or had blown off accidentally. Why the sight of an attic room with the cover removed should elicit such a visceral reaction, forcing the child to physically withdraw like an animal shrinking from a flame, Preston could not fathom. Nor was he able to question the boy, for no sooner had he turned around than the boy, as if suddenly released from the pause in a game of musical statues, sprang back into life and sprinted away down the hall, calling back something that was likely, "It is dark up there," but which, muffled by his haste and the echoes of the corridor, sounded to Preston more like, "There's dark up there," or "The dark lives up there." Though he spends some lines considering exactly why many tend to feel uneasy when entering such spaces, Preston, in his letter to his sister that day, stops short of including himself within that number, and affects an air of detached clarity which might not have been entirely genuine. Whilst he does outline his intention to speak to the innkeeper, in order to explain that he would prefer the attic space closed, as it was somewhat unsightly, and could, he feared, be an entrance for all manner of draughts if the weather becomes less pleasant, he stops short of expressing any actual trepidation about the presence of such a hole, and well short of expressing any superstitious concerns in relation to the attic space, or it being so nakedly open. At supper, Preston writes, his attempts to raise the issue of the open attic were thwarted by the sheer force and volume of his host's husband, who, in a transparent attempt to escape the clutches of his beloved, suggested repeatedly, almost to the point of insistence, that Preston join him on the links for a round of golf, despite Preston's own insistence that he lacked the equipment, not to mention the motivation, to do so. Fleeing from this imposition before he could be pinned down to an actual time or commitment, Preston ate his supper quickly, excused himself far earlier than expected, and retreated to his room, cursing himself as he did for not mentioning the blasted hole. Still, his letter, which signs off cheerily, shows no indication of the trepidation and hesitance toward that attic room that would invade his thoughts that night. Only in his next letter does any such fear creep into the text. That night, Preston explains, he found that sleep came only in snatched, fitful bursts. He reports several times during the night awaking with the oppressive feeling of being watched. After several failed attempts to settle, he writes mournfully, I resolved to light a candle, find some volume that might be close to hand, and read until drowsiness overtook me. This plan, however, was never fully realized, for whilst I did succeed in lighting the candle and retrieving the book I wanted from the shelf, I found myself wholly unable to concentrate upon the text. Time and again I would near the end of a sentence and feel my eyes and thoughts wandering, as if pulled or tugged by an invisible force or instinct, away from the page and towards that gaping hole in the corner of the room. I remember sitting, propped up in bed, and struggling to see much beyond the end of the bed. The candle's dim light reached only so far into the darkness, so that beyond the measure of a few feet only the vaguest outline of shapes were perceptible. Still, the hole leading to the attic was clear, the black square appearing somehow blacker even than the rest of the room, as if that one patch had been painted with a darker shade or deeper pigment. Even in the darkness, that place was darker still. Staring into that space, Preston notes, he came slowly but surely to understand his young friend's reticence, and, for the first time, he felt it necessary to pull the bedclothes up and around him, not for want of warmth, but to feel in some way more secure, like a child hiding beneath a blanket, huddled in fear of the bogeyman. Time and again he attempted to return, with little luck, to his book. Finally, in a fit of frustration, he decided it was a lost cause and turned on his side to extinguish the candle. No sooner had he shifted in bed, however, than a sound stopped him in his tracks. Preston froze. At first, he wondered if the sound might have been his own doing, that he might, in pulling across the bed, have tugged the sheets or disturbed the blankets in such a way that might have created such a noise. But no. Even as he stayed silent, still, and fixed in position, one hand reaching toward the candle's flame, the sound persisted. It was a low, shuffling scrape. The hiss and pull, thought Preston, of things moving in that very space above him. There was, he said, sitting there in the hush of night, with only the candle's gentle crackle to disturb the silence, something strangely ominous about that hole and that whispered suggestion of sound. As he stared at the space, unable to tear his eyes away, the scintilla of an idea began to creep upon him, the idea of this hole as a portal or door to some other place, the entrance to a cave or hollow, in which some hunched and wretched thing in a shuffle of tattered cloth could be squatted, waiting. In daylight, he knew he would dismiss such ideas as fanciful, but here, in the quiet of this room, they were pressingly, awfully real. Again, the hiss and the shuffle came, this time accompanied by a creak, a slow, aching whine as one of the floorboards in the space above him protested against the weight of someone walking above. Perhaps, thought Preston, it is the wind. Some draught slithering through cracks in the wood, disturbing whatever collection of long-forgotten objects might be stored in that nook. No sooner had this thought emerged, however, than it was dismissed by the sight of the candle's flame, straight, still, and undisturbed by any current of air. Then came the thud, a heavy, rounded thunk of impact, as something suddenly dropped heavily from that space above and landed hard in the empty space beyond the foot of his bed. Reeling and recoiling in a tangled swirl of bedclothes and blankets, Preston, his heart pounding in his throat, legs flailing and kicking wildly against the sheet, tried in vain to escape and dive from the bed. his mind filled, he said, with images of some chimp-like thing that had, on lengthy sinewed arms, lowered itself from that place above and dropped with a cushioned thump to the space at the end of his bed. Again and again he kicked to escape, but succeeded only in falling from the bed, tumbling to the ground below so that he hit the boards with a thud many times louder than the one he had heard. As he desperately pulled and tugged at the sheets to free himself from the constricting coils, he looked over toward the space from which the awful sound had come, and saw nothing. No deformed intruder, no sign of the stooping, ill-made thing, the troglodyte of his nightmare fancies. Instead, he saw, in that space, a book, a large volume, beautifully bound, with dust still gently settling around it. Rising to his feet and reaching somewhat hastily for the candle, he first held it at arm's length, searching and scouring the corners of the room for any trace of his imagined horrors. Then, once satisfied that he was indeed alone in the room, he moved toward the tome. It had, undoubtedly, fallen from above, from out of that still black square, and landed heavily on the ground below, almost perfectly beneath it. Lifting the book to examine its contents, Preston immediately felt himself becoming excited. Inside were beautifully illuminated pages, in a mixture of not only Greek and Latin scripts, but Syriac Aramaic. Hardly able to contain his excitement, Preston laid the book flat on the bed, realizing almost immediately that this was a significant find, a text of many centuries' age that had, up until this point, been undocumented and undescribed. What fortune, he thought, that such a thing should fall, almost literally, into the hands of a scholar such as himself, for whom the study of manuscripts and comparative religion was a speciality. It was at this point that an idea occurred to Preston, a thought that thrilled him so that his insides seemed to whirl and dance with excitement. Was it possible, he thought, considering from whence this book had obviously come, that there might be more? At once, all of Preston's secret fantasies of presenting hitherto unseen manuscripts through the university, being lauded amongst his peers as the first not only to discover these key texts, but to unlock their secrets, rose like a flame within him. His earlier fear transformed almost immediately to a species of fervid excitement. Scurrying hastily to the bedside table, he quickly retrieved 2 or 3 more candles. Placing 2 of them carefully into holders and another into the neck of an empty bottle, he placed them on the floor around the space where the book had fallen. Suddenly, the square above looked less black and, in the golden wash provided by the candles, showed its edges of warm, ancient wood. How old, Preston wondered, was this building? How old the village in which it resided, and, more importantly, what undiscovered treasures might the forgotten corners of such a place be hiding? Moving toward the heavy oak desk, he carefully removed from the wall the mirror that had been hanging there. Carrying it across the room, he placed it carefully onto the floor, so that it lay directly below the entrance to the attic. Above this, he held the hand mirror that had been left for him on the dresser. Angling the flame of one candle with one hand, so that the light crept reluctantly up into the attic space, and maneuvering the hand-held mirror with the other, he was able to explore, in reflection at least, some of what that shadowy room concealed. What he saw, revealed in the glass, made his heart almost skip a beat. It was a tiny, cramped, but well-stocked library. Shelves of books from ceiling to floor, all of them beautifully bound and covered over with a layer of dust so thick that it was a wonder the shelves had not already bowed under its weight. Above and around these volumes were rolls of vellum, wound up like scrolls, bound with careful knots of lace. Beside the shelves, great folios, almost the height of a man's waist, rested heavy and filled with sheets of parchment, the visible edges of which, even from this vantage point, glimmered with the sheen of stunning gold leaf. Giddy with excitement and a burning desire to explore this space and its content in detail, Preston looked around the room for some means of getting to it. It was too late now to ask for a ladder to be brought, but perhaps, he thought, he might arrange the furniture in such a way, a chair placed atop the desk perhaps, that he might be able to pull himself up and into the space, accessing its riches even before the rest of the house awoke. It was only as he turned to reach for the chair that he started with fright at the tiny figure standing in the doorway. It was the boy, waiting, perfectly silent in stocking feet, just at the threshold of the room. When, and indeed how, the door to his chambers had been opened and the boy had padded silently to its entrance, Preston was at a loss to explain. But there he was, wide-eyed and silent, still holding his tiny soldier. Moving toward him quickly, Preston intended to challenge the boy as to why he was out of bed at such an hour, and hoped to return him to his own rooms as quickly as possible, so that he might return to his newly discovered treasure. Before he could advance further, however, the boy stepped around him and, moving almost noiselessly, pattered toward the small arrangement of candles and mirrors that Preston had created. Squatting down, so that only his face and hands were visible in the meagre light, the boy noiselessly lifted the hand mirror and angled it toward the attic. What Preston saw, he said, was impossible. Whilst the mirror, lying flat along the floor, retained its image of a book-filled room, the other mirror somehow displayed an entirely different scene. Here, though it should have shown the exact same space, was a different room entirely, a beautifully lit and sumptuously decorated room stuffed to the brim with toys of every description. From colourful dolls to soldiers and spinning tops, rocking horses and games of skittles, all standing where earlier scrolls had been visible. In place of books, the shelves were instead filled with jar upon jar of colourful sweets, from candy canes to sherbet lemons, all of them enticing, all of them clear to see. As Preston opened his mouth to speak, to ask how such a thing was possible, the boy hurriedly shushed him, raising a single finger and pressing it firmly against his cherubic lips. Then, with a slow, deliberate gesture, he brought that same finger to point gently to his ear. "Listen," the boy was saying, without ever uttering a sound. For a few moments the pair remained in silence. The boy, now kneeling, gazed fixedly upward into the hole, whilst the man towering over him observed his every movement. At last, with tiny, almost imperceptible slowness, a shape began to descend from the hole. Gliding smoothly downward on a piece of silken thread, a toy soldier, suspended with a noose-like knot around its throat, was lowered by some unseen hand from above, so that it came to a stop and dangled a few centimetres from the boy's face. Though he peered intently into the shadows, Preston was unable to see anyone holding the other end of the line. It seemed, for all intents and purposes, to have emerged somehow from the very darkness itself. With a croaking whisper, the boy finally spoke. "It's for me. He can see me, kneeling here. He sent me down a treat. He wants for me to take it." As the boy extended his tiny hand out toward the twirling figure, Preston all at once saw its hideous meaning. Here was not some gift presented by an unseen friend, but rather some species of lure, dangled as enticement, like a worm before a fish. It was a thing the boy desired, a sweet temptation for him to take. The toy, the sweets, the room, all of it was bait. He had seen his own desire, the boy was seeing his. Moving closer toward them would no doubt end badly for both. Lunging forward, Preston batted at the young boy's hand, hoping to prevent him from touching the wretched gift. The boy, however, had already withdrawn. Clearly, he had no intention of being coaxed or inveigled by this ruse. Instead, In a series of swift, evasive movements, he angled the mirror this way and that, searching and scouring the angles of the space until, at last, he fixed on a particular spot and screamed at once, "See, it's him! He's here! See, it's him! It's him!" What, precisely, it was that suddenly rushed out of view, Preston has been unable to tell. From his perspective there was, he said, little more than a darting blur, a shape, caught for only an instant in the tilting surface of the mirror, so that whatever it was, it must have been to some extent distorted. Still, he writes with cryptic unease, whatever it was that darted past, in a flurry of skittering feet, it was almost the size of a man, and moved in crooked, stooping lunges. From the brief glimpse I had of it, it appeared to be almost entirely grey, and appeared, even in that tiniest of glimpses, to have row upon row of teeth. Clasping the boy firmly by the waist, Preston dragged him and ran from the room, along the landing and through the nearest open door into an adjacent room, one that turned out to be the boy's own. As dawn began to colour the sky, the boy explained how that small space was covered over again and again by his parents, only to be found open again in the morning. He spoke, with a sort of curling reticence, of how he had heard a voice calling to him softly from that attic, a hiss of little whispers, telling him to come and play. The voice, he said, had promised him things, candy apples and beautiful toys, sweets and wooden soldiers. But when I went into the room, he said, I saw his hand peeping out, and it wasn't alive. The hand, he said, had been curled around the edge of the wood, peeking ever so slightly out from the edge of the hole, and looked to him less like a hand and more like the foot of a bird, long and thin and sharp. The events described in these letters took place around 3 months prior to me penning this story. Though Preston confronted the owners of the inn with both his own story and the boy's, they remained stubbornly incredulous. Whilst they promised to once again cover over the hole and to seal up the attic for good, they steadfastly refused to go up and investigate, or to prevent any further guests from spending a night in that room. This situation would, of course, raise quite some alarm, were it not for the fact that the inn in question burned to the ground a little over a week ago. Fortunately, an anonymous warning enabled the owner's family and their guests to escape entirely unharmed, but the building itself was not so lucky. The entire structure and all of its contents were reduced completely to ashes. Whilst I'm sure that, under the circumstances, some might be tempted to look in Preston's direction when searching for a suspect for this arson, especially after his vocal protests and subsequent letters to the family, I can assure you that he was in no way responsible, nor could he have been. In fact, Preston and I spent the entire duration of that evening in the tavern, surrounded by a host of other patrons who would happily verify our whereabouts were it ever to be called into question. This, in itself, is a curious detail, as he and I had never ventured out alone together on such a jaunt before. As luck would have it, we chose that night of all nights to do so, albeit not of our own volition, but at my wife's suggestion and highly vocal insistence. This has been Preston's Attic, a short horror story. Written by Michael Vandervoort. Narrated by Robin Reads. Copyright 2024 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.